Hi everyone, I am Azel, and in this video, I'll be giving you a crash course on the Smith-Morra Gambit. What is the Smith-Morra Gambit? It is an aggressive way to combat the Sicilian that starts with e4, c5, d4, cd, and c3, offering a pawn sacrifice in return for a strategically dominant position. Not only does white have an extra pawn in the center and an extra piece developed, the bishops are ready to activate, whereas black will have to invest more time into pawn moves to free his bishops. This gambit also works if you are a d4 player looking to meet 1c5. We go 2e4 and we get back the same position. And aside from its energetic nature, another appeal of this gambit is that there is no need to memorize lines excessively compared to the alternatives. For example, if against the Sicilian, you play knight f3 as your second move, you will need to be prepared against a diverse set of sharp and highly theoretical lines as early as move 2. Instead of memory work, all you need to be familiar with in the Smith-Morra Gambit are the main plans and tactical ideas. So without further ado, let's get to it. The first thing to look at is the development scheme. Most of the time, you can expect to bring your pieces in this way. The knight goes to f3, bishop c4, short castle, followed by queen e2 to vacate d1 so that the rook can control the half-open file, followed by bishop f4 or g5, or maybe even e3, and finally rook a to c1, where the other rook can control the fully open c file. Now that we've got the general setup covered, I will show you how to punish black tactically if he's not careful along the way. Now this doesn't mean that you will need to memorize the exact moves to play against hundreds of fringe attempts which you might never actually get in the game. We actually only need to know the recurring tactical themes and killer moves. So let's explore those. The first idea is to lay siege to f7. Whenever black develops slowly or unconventionally, you can be sure that the answer is nearly always a well-timed bishop takes f7, or in some cases, even knight g5. And this position is no exception. Because of black's unsound development, white has a simple tactical resource. Bishop takes f7, followed by queen d5, and queen takes rook. And in just 8 moves, white has recovered his pawn, has gained an exchange, and to top it all off, black has lost the right to castle. Another example, if black doesn't bring out any pieces, for example say with d6, then queen c7, again, the best response will be bishop takes f7. After king takes, both our knights can occupy very good squares in the flesh, and if queen a5, then bishop d2, and black has to play queen d8 to defend against knight c7, but after bishop e3, this position is lost for black. He cannot defend against all the threats. There's no stopping bishop b6 followed by knight c7, or knight b6 followed by knight takes c8, because if knight to d7 to cover b6, we have knight to e6. We're hitting the queen, we're going to land a knight on c7, and the game is over. In fact, if black does not play e6 to combat bishop takes f7 check, he will get into trouble. For example, let's say black develops normally with d6 to get his light square bishop out in the next move. This seemingly principled developing move is already a mistake, because we've got bishop takes f7 check again, and after king takes, knight g5 check, and queen takes bishop. And we've got our pawn back while maintaining a substantial lead in development. And black can't even work around this by playing knight f6 earlier to overprotect g4, because again comes bishop takes f7, and now that black has spent his time on knight f6 and not knight c6, this queen is unprotected, and we have knight to e5, making use of this spin and adding 2 attackers to the bishop. Again, we get our pawn back and we are winning positionally. Even worse is if black ever plays e5, because this means after bishop c4, he can never blunt our bishop with e6. And in this way, we can pile up on f7 with slower moves, such as knight to g5. And here white is already better. d5 is the only defense, which returns the pawn, when white still has a good lead in development. And here, black cannot even win the d5 pawn, with bishop takes b5, because after knight takes d5, we have queen takes knight, winning the knight. If queen takes d5, we get the queen back with knight to c7. And so to sum up the first idea, in the Smith-Morra Gambit, we very often benefit tactically by attacking f7 with bishop takes f7 check. And if black ever plays e5, knight g5 will be a serious move to entertain. Another strong tactical resource you have is pushing your e4 pawn to e5. It restricts black's mobility and opens up the position in white's favor, since white is ahead in development. So let's see this in action. Recall that, in this position, black cannot play bishop g4 on pain of bishop takes f7, followed by knight e5 check, where the knight cannot be taken because of the pin. So let's suppose that black first played knight c6 to overprotect the queen and prepare bishop g4. But that's when we can bring a stop to that with e5. And here's a quick exercise for you. If black takes the pawn with the knight, how should white continue? Pause the video if you need more time. The answer is knight takes e5. After pawn takes, we follow with a very familiar idea, bishop takes f7, and we win the queen. So the question is, what if black had taken with the pawn instead? We have a slightly surprising move, queen takes queen. And I say that it is a little surprising because generally speaking, white will prefer not to trade queens when down materially and ahead in development. However, white is not giving up on an attack just because the queens are off. In fact, white's activity is so overwhelmingly superior that he can attack with the minor pieces alone. So let's consider both ways to recapture the queen. If king takes, we could go for bishop takes f7, but there comes e6, and our bishop is trapped. So we should go for something stronger, and that is knight to g5, adding more firepower, and black does not have a satisfactory response to the threat of knight takes f7. So really, knight takes d8 is virtually forced. And as I said, even though the queens are off, white's initiative doesn't stop. There comes knight to b5, threatening the fork, and there really is no easy way to defend against it. If king d7, we've got mate in 2. And if knight to e6, we can take and fork. So the only move that black has to stay in the game is rook to b8. But white's threats don't stop. Knight e5 now, to threaten knight to c7, not with a fork, but with checkmate. Black has to vacate the e7 square, but knight c7 comes anyway, forcing the king to block his own bishop. And again, we can threaten mate with bishop to e3, and if king d6 to fork the two knights, we have bishop f4, and black will surely lose material. So that was an example of how the e5 push can be used to open the position in white's favor. But beyond that, e5 can also be used to grab space. Let's suppose black tries to control e5 by fianchettoing his bishop. White could continue with the typical development scheme by castling, but another option you have is e5, grabbing more space and stopping knight f6. And this pawn is untakeable because of the earlier tactical idea, bishop takes f7, and we get the piece back. There's no saving it with king f6. Both knight e4 or bishop g5 will suffice. And one last simple example of e5 in action. Even if black plays an early e6 to defend against bishop f7, he's not out of the woods yet. It is very easy for black to get into trouble if he just develops nonchalantly. And here, there is already e5 to take advantage of the pin. After knight e8, knight takes, we go bishop f4, knight b5 is coming, and black is losing. Alright, that's all for how to play the Smith-Morra Gambit accepted. To sum it up, your opponent will need to play rather passively after taking the pawn. So no early e5, bishop g4, a6 b5, etc. Otherwise, if black does go for more exotic development schemes, you should look to punish it tactically by abusing the f7 square with bishop takes f7 or knight to g5, as well as the e5 push. And the final thing we need to be fully ready to play the gambit is to know how to meet players who decline it. So let's first consider deviations on the third move. Here our threat is to play c takes d4 and form an impressive center. So black has to either push d3 or counter-attack e4 with knight f6 or d5. If d3, we'll go bishop takes d3 followed by c4 to control d5 and also vacate the c3 square for our knight. And we can easily complete the rest of our development with knight f3, h3, knight c3, short castle, and bishop e3, never fearing knight b4 to d3, since this one is a bad bishop anyway. And so that's for the d3 decline. If black declines with d5 instead, we will recapture on d4 of the queen to defend e4. And after knight to f6, we want to find a good square for our queen. c2 isn't great because of an eventual rook to c8, and it can be a little bit unpleasant to have your queen opposite the rook. So I would much prefer e2. But of course, we don't want to block in our own bishop, so bishop to b5 first. And the strong side of this move is that the queen on e4 prevents knight to c6, as well as bishop to d7. So black has to settle for knight to d7, and now that our bishop is out, our queen can go to e2, and the rest of the opening plays itself. We will continue with knight to f3, short castle, bishop f4, knight d2, and put our rooks in the center. The last serious decline is knight to f6. We are of course going to go e5, knight d5, queen takes pawn, e6, knight f3, knight c6, and queen e4. If your opponent plays the knight f6 decline, you can expect nearly all your games to follow these moves. From here, there are only two serious tries, f5 and d6. If f5, we'll go queen e2 to keep an eye on e5, fianchetto our bishop, and castle short. If d6, we'll go bishop b5, and we just want to open a d-file with c4, e takes d6, castles, and rook to d1. And if black takes us first, we'll recapture with the queen and retreat to e2 when the pin is broken. And now we go on to fringe attempts on move 2. With my own experience, nobody plays anything other than c takes d4 in serious games. But in online chess, many players like to pre-move their second move when playing the Sicilian. So, let's start with the worst. Knight c6, we'll go d5 and claim a very strong center. If d6, we'll take on c5, and if d takes c5, we'll trade queens into a moderately winning ending, where we are a little bit faster, since both our bishops are free, whereas black's dark square bishop still needs 2 moves to come out. Moreover, we still have the right to castle. Avoiding the queen ending, with queen to a5 check, then queen to c5, just doesn't cut it for black either. There's no compensation for white's much faster development. And finally, if black goes e6, you can either go for d5 or knight to f3. And as soon as it looks like we're returning to open Sicilian territory, we play c3, transposing right back to the Smith-Morra Gambit. And if knight f6, we go e5, then queen takes d4, and we have already seen this position. Alright, so that's all for the Smith-Morra Gambit crash course. I want to re-emphasize that this is not meant to be a comprehensive repertoire that covers every variation in detail, but a guide to a few typical plans and ideas such as where the pieces belong, and some common tactical themes such as an attack on f7. In the next video, I'll be diving into this gambit into even greater detail, discussing what ideas you have even if your opponent doesn't falter early on. So, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon.